She's a professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at University of Washington. She has a BFA in graphic design from RISD, which if Don Norman were here, he would characterize her, unlike the rest of us, as a, quote, real designer. And she did graphic design there. She got a master's degree in computer science from University of Chicago, a PhD from some state university up north, I think Berkeley, and she did a postdoc at Stanford in the program in Science, Technology, and Society. And one of the reasons she's here, of many reasons, she just came out with a new book from MIT Press called Critical Fabulations, which I think she will tell us something about today. I always try to find some facts about speakers that they're maybe surprised that I know. I have a few of those. As an undergrad, she created a documentary film conveying how the Holocaust and World War II deeply affected her own family, including interviews with many members of her family. On a lighter note, she bakes bread. She's known as a foodie. She's fluent in German. I find out all kinds of things. In graduate school, she played ultimate frisbee. She was known as, I quote, the gazelle.
Oh my God.
And in the words of a rival team, she was known as that expletive deleted gazelle, which we can't say. And today she's going to talk about critical fabulations. And
amazing.
And just to end with, ideas really have histories, and they're like people. They can really only be understood in the context of those histories. And I think one of the things that Daniela has done really well is to realize that practices have histories, and they can only be really understood in the context of those histories. And she's looked very critically at design, both historically, and I think paints a picture that makes us reinterpret the history of that practice, and also makes us look to new ways of looking at design for the future. So the gazelle will now speak.
Wow. Thank you so much. That, I mean, no words can respond to that incredible introduction. That was phenomenal. Definitely the best. Mic drop. Yes, so thank you, Jim. Thanks to everyone who came to join me today, and to Ian for organizing. I've known some of the folks in this room for a really long time, and it's just such a pleasure to kind of come back to a place there are so many familiar faces, but they weren't here the last time I was here, so how cool. So whose stories underpin design? And what might be possible if designers, all of us, were to tell those stories differently? So these are kind of the underlying questions that my book, Critical Fabulations, asks. And I do this by looking at a series of case studies. These are cases that sort of bear out these methods that sort of come out of a retracing. And I'm going to talk about the way in which those cases unfold, and they kind of span areas of actually a case considering Bay Area hackerspace collectives, a case in which Sarah Fox in the audience has worked with me on, and a case on the transatlantic slave trade, in which I've been collaborating with the person more recently connected with. And it's also cases of the kind of computing industry as it began sort of to think through histories of manufacturing in new ways. And I'm going to speak about that last case a bit more today, and its underlying concern for fabulation. So fabulation, or Latin fabulare, is meaning to relay as fable or myth. It comes out of the particle stem fabulari, to speak. And feminist scholars, Vincent Despres, Saidiya Hartman, have separately discussed fabulation as a kind of form of storytelling, one that sort of blends the real and the imaginary in a form that sort of rebuilds the worlds around them. So Despres, in her book, What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions, describes a sort of complicated relationship between animals and humans. She's sort of carefully multiplying and even inverting the stories that are told by and about science. And in this, she observes to create stories or to make histories, to reconstruct, to fabulate in a way that opens other possibilities for the past, in the present, and the future. Later, from Saidiya Hartman, I learned what it could mean to narrate the impossible, to sort of make visible that scandal of historical memory within the archives that render the lives of people like Venus, a female slave, unknowable and unknown. So she's coined the phrase critical fabulation in her vivid 2008 essay, Venus in Two Acts, to describe this approach of sort of writing against the limits of the historical archive. So she's saying by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing the sequence of events in divergent stories, and from contested points of view, I've attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received and authorized account, to imagine what it might have happened, or what might have been said, or what might have been done. Now, bringing this kind of fabulatory practice to design, I'm trying to understand our practice, this practice that involves kind of the building of worlds around us, often involving technology development, as a kind of process that is both activist and investigative, that is personally and culturally situated, and that's also responsive and responsible. So I want to show that what it means to do this kind of work entails kind of two forms of intervention. So the first is that it takes to coming to terms with design's dominant intellectual lineage, sort of coming to know its histories and commitments anew. And this is a project that I've grounded in feminist technoscience. And second, it suggests enhancing these existing methodologies based on those alternative inheritances. So this work demands engaging sort of different bodies, practices, and programs within which the contemporary sites of design have emerged. So enlarging the kind of very methods and relationships out of which designers conceive or sort of author worldly change. And together, these interventions then make room for sort of drawing the intellectual trajectory of design otherwise. So it means inviting these new ways of making and inhabiting kind of the situation of our world today. And across these two interventions, so critical fabulations may do more than just destabilize this dominant paradigm. It can also kind of show that those who are disenfranchised from cultures of innovation and technology development are nonetheless actively contributing to them. And to understand how, I want to share with you a story that I tell within the book. This began when I came across circa 2010, a 2008 documentary miniseries. It was called Moon Machines. And in this image here is sort of 2-second clip. You see sort of two women with rolled up sleeves passing a needle through a grid of metal eyelet holes. And to many, this process could actually resemble a process of weaving, right? Lacing threads in orthogonal directions, creating a kind of textile form. But here the weavers are using unconventional materials. They're using magnetic rings and wire in this sort of odd-shaped room that's a narrow desk with these two rectangular spaces around it. And over this scene broadcasts the voice of a managing director who says, "We call this the LOL method. It's a little old lady method of wiring these cores." So this footage, which is just a few seconds long and silent if not for that narration, is one of the only surviving accounts of the women who physically wove the software for the Apollo missions during the 1960s. So threading wires around and through these donut-shaped magnetic cores created a form of information storage known as core memory. And here you can see pictured the core memory rope, which was the principal mechanism by which computers during the 1950s and 60s retrieved and stored information. So in the case of this core rope here, the passing of a wire through the donut-shaped magnet would create a 1, while passing it around would create a 0. So the design of the Apollo guidance computer began in 1961, and this was a time when computing machines were sort of massive, heavy, ran on extreme amounts of electricity, punch cards. And unlike these boom-sized machines, the code that Apollo missions required needed to fit into the cone of a rocket, right? And so this meant it had to run on limited electricity, it had to withstand extreme vibrations, and in fact, it had to do all of that while keeping fairly compact within that space. So the temperatures were far beyond what a typical clean room would be. The weaving of these cores met all of those challenges. Most of what we know today about Apollo 8, this sort of first manned mission to the moon and back, was deriving from the stories that were told about and by the American white men, engineers, and managers like Batten, who were audible on the moon machines. And so bringing critical fabulations to the scene meant asking sort of what stories of the little old ladies brings to this work of design and engineering. What is it that we can glean from the very few accounts that have survived? So to begin asking this question, I looked at the broader process of core memory plane development. And this formed alongside an informed core rope memory, but it involved even smaller weaving instruments and even microscopes that were necessary, you see pictured here. And while collecting initial archival material on this process, I came across a sort of small number of 1960s P2, P8 core memory planes that were for sale on eBay. And in my hands, I found these planes incredible. They were square and compact, but also reminded me deeply of another kind of complementary mode of feminized memory production. In fact, over the coming months, I assembled a collaborative team, including fabulous researcher Samantha Shorey, master quilter Helen Remick, and Brock Kraft, a technologist in my department, who's all together we situated core memory development within these feminized lineages of practice. Together, we built an interactive electronic quilt made up of the core memory planes. And the patches would then materialize the work of the core memory weavers, as well as kind of produce these new points of encounter. So they cast craft work as almost a mode of hardware manufacturing, and in turn, hardware manufacturing as a mode of craft work. And during this series of workshops, we would invite groups of historians of technology in particular, at design educators, members of the public who were visiting a maker summit, high school students who visited the library, and several others to assemble what we called these patch kits. The kits were comprising a kind of board loom, strings, beads, almost kindergarten craft materials in place of the ferrite core and wire. And each kit then became a future quilt square. Once assembled, the patches then acted as tools to explore our archive of media materials. So these were first-hand accounts of core memory production that we collected through interviews, as well as archival research we had done along the way. And plugging in this newly assembled patch into the quilt would then sort of play these oral accounts of core memory production. But they would also then tweet the material from our LOL Weavers account. So these tweets then were reflecting roughly the same number of characters once held in the original core memory planes. One tweet highlighted sort of the gender dexterity of the weavers, with Ed Blondin saying the female operators were good at it, and those who stood around telling them what to do were terrible at it. In the workshops, we fabricated at scales that were equivalent to just a few millimeters of weaving on the 1960s core memory planes. Helen, our collaborator, said, I was having fun realizing we were creating a macro chip. She said, sort of drawing comparison right to the microchip that we have so little access to as users of these technologies. But a key event during this process was this immaculately typed and printed note that I received in the mail from Frederick Dill, a celebrated core memory engineer and co-inventor of the semiconductor laser. So I'd been in contact with him during the project, and he wrote me, until this discussion, I have never heard of stringing cores as a weaving problem, but it is certainly a good view. Struck by this, I thought to kind of follow up, and I reached out to him via email, and he wrote to me, you have focused on the threads, the wires, whereas I focused on the cores. Your focus on weaving is an equally valid viewpoint, but a different one. It sort of assumes that particular configuration of weaving will produce what is needed, which is totally correct. So by attending kind of to the weaving alongside the electrical cores, this labor of production alongside the thing, we began to see these different stories of contingency and embodied practice emerge. So these renowned figures, such as Dill, who are identifying the weave as the pivotal innovation, right? The mechanism that will, in his words, produce what is needed. So this insight was pretty unusual, not only due to this sort of widespread omission of these insights from the core memory literature, but also this sort of deeper recognition of bodies and many bodies of women of color who were central contributors to the engineering process. As we all continue to work towards these narratives, we had to reflect back on where we began. Building the quilt, we encountered the process in ways that completely challenged public accounts. So in the MIT museum footage sort of describing and introducing the Apollo guidance computer, we hear the interviewing journalist ask, she doesn't have to think about which of the cores it goes through next. No, Jack Poundstone says, he's a Raytheon manager, the machine does that for her. Right? This conception of the weavers as sort of unthinking executors of code, rather than inventive contributors, so these conceptions reverberate across and throughout public narratives of the Apollo mission. And once we, in these workshops and on our own, were weaving the core memory ourselves, we found then these perceptions much harder to hold. We began to see, in a sense, what Nisa Nakamura cautions us against while peering inside the machine. She says, not dancing bunny-suited clean room workers happily making chips for free. Instead, she suggests, looking inside digital culture means both looking back in time to the roots of the computer industry and the specific material production practices that position race and gender as commodities in electronic factories. So our project casts design methods as sort of powerful sites for challenging these histories that not only sort of reassert divisions between cognitive and manual labor, but also hide those locales, practices, and bodies that are rarely associated with innovation work. So here, design and technology become metaphors for the improvement of economic conditions, but in fact, non-designers, like these little old ladies, embattle the forms of knowledge distribution to which they are subjected. So in collaborating with the ghosts of design, sort of what Avery Gordon might call these hauntings, we began to rework these dominant commitments. These commitments articulated by several scholars have been quite inspirational to me, including in the room Lilia Rane, Christo Sims, Serem Avle, Sarita Amrute, and Sylvia Lindner. I want to work past four in particular stances that I hope will be of value to you in the room. And the first is this sort of popular historical narrative that tends to valorize the work of inventors and innovators, which are focusing on the achievements of people like Neil Armstrong. So this is where we start to recognize that, in fact, hundreds of thousands of people contributed to the Apollo missions. And in decentering that individual's view, our moments for reworking and retelling stories of design could open that possibility for using material production to form kinds of alliances. So this means new investigative partnerships with the past and present. And to investigate the work and legitimate it, designers tend to frame that work as neutral. They try not to taint maybe that work, and we often internalize this as tainting it with our own preferences or our own agendas and concerns. But our forms of storytelling also in the Quilt project further entangled the objectivist and situated perspectives. So this means connecting those who see design from the outside with those who work from within. And this is a stance that sought to recuperate those neglected histories of encounter. And to help reach wider audiences, designers often seek those universal insights, right? Designing for a general user, which often comes down to designing for a dominant group. In our critical fabulations, we're expanding and deepening these long-standing historical focuses on code and programmers to kind of account for the practices of making hardware. The electronic quilt positioned that work of weaving core memory as a kind of interference, proposing these sorts of contingent analyses that change existing practice. And lastly, to identify opportunities, designers often direct these exercises toward a fixed end, a solution. So our work in attending to the macro chip, for example, this sort of mending of broken circuitry that our project required, that opened this opportunity for using design as an extension, so sustaining material outputs through their continued circulation in practice. And resetting these contemporary design narratives involves exposing the tensions between them. In this case, it involves these two stories of practice. And looking at those intersections, this kind of retracing of design's commitments, designers can begin to more fully address those problems and possibilities previously seen as irrelevant. So when famed Nobel laureate Herbert Simon sort of cast design as a science of the artificial, he was helping to sediment a kind of cognitivist orientation toward design and development within a burgeoning design methods movement. And this perspective, we could argue, begins to render the investigators and their social status irrelevant, or even worse, perhaps jeopardizing the scientific purity of thought. But years later, a feminist scholar named Allison Adams pointed out that, in fact, the various subjects in Newell and Simon's experiments were sample who were representing the general population, but seemed to be only men, and not only that, but students at Carnegie Mellon University. So as the ideas descend, these stories tend to stay the same. The methods of participatory design that made important inroads in the borderlands of elite technology development firms failed to overturn what Sarah Ahmed has called this sort of liberal promise of inclusion. Perspectives that sort of obscure the structural effects of, say, racism or sexism, and the logics of individualism and solutionism that bear those out. They live on in even the work of contemporary critical design, which I've also been a part of. So as I learned in the fieldwork that I did at the Stanford D School, resetting design is actually requiring more than just an alternative theoretical perspective. It's also about exposing in what ways designers' central ideological commitments may deepen the very same inequalities that we seek to upend. So in these intellectual themes, and sort of in the particular integration of thinking and doing, is this project of critical fabulation. Critical fabulations are ways of telling stories that awaken silent histories. They could deconstruct design methods to open different possibilities for the past that reconfigure the present creating opportunities for the future. So this involves a kind of treatment of the canonical design history as a site of critical rereading, right? The resulting stories work as more than conceptual orientations. They both describe and remake our methods of design. So currently, I'm continuing this work with several incredible collaborators, Sarah Fox in the room and several others at University of Washington. And we are specifically looking through the various ways we can deconstruct design in particular configurations that note the ghosts haunting the present. And I want to end these words of Saidiya Hartman's: inheritances are chosen as much as they are passed on. Strivings and failures shape the stories we tell. Thank you very much.